Brewing Inc. is now syndicated on SeriousWriter.com. See them at SeriousWriter.com for resources, articles, videos, topical classes, and now a podcast, the Brewing Inc. Podcast, because we're syndicated on SeriousWriter.com.
All right, well, welcome back to Interbrews. This is another interview that we have for our Brew and Ink crew. And I'm just going to get right into it. We have a really special guest with us today, and I'm really excited about this interview on this topic. We have Tina Yeager with us. Hello, Tina.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing well. We were just talking about Stranger Things, and Tina is a fellow author. And she also loves, however you want to call it, spec fic or fantasy science fiction. You're also a writer in that kind of genre, right?
Geek, whatever you want to call
it.
Geek,
nerd, right? Talking about Stranger Things, that's what I was called a lot of in the 80s. And now it's a cool thing, right? Now you're cool if you're a nerd. But Tina is also a counselor. And she has a lot of experience with this. And I just asked her to come on the show and just kind of talk about diversity in literature and diversity in the media as far as entertainment is concerned. But to really focus on people with either mental disabilities or people with mental illnesses. Obviously, those are two different things. But just how we can start to include people in a way that is without stigma, that has dignity to it, that treats them as real characters that we can get into. And so we're going to kind of get into some of that. But first, just tell everybody just kind of some of your experience getting into counseling. I know you started kind of as an author a little bit, but then you got into your kind of career as a counselor. So tell people how you got into that.
There's been a lot of back and forth between writing and mental health in my background. I started out both as a writer and even as a kid. I had a little book that I wrote of meditations, believe it or not, when I was like 8 or 9, which is really bizarre. Talk about geeky. That was really weird. I even had an about the author page on the back of my little notebook.
Yeah, you did.
It was just like super nerdy. But I wrote nonfiction and fiction as a kid. And then as I grew older and had a child, I felt like I was called to write. And I began to write children's stories. I had a bachelor's degree in creative writing. And then I was also told that I should look into being a counselor. So I went to get a master's degree in counseling. And after my master's degree in counseling and began that practice, I also felt like I was nudged back toward that writing call. And I wrote novels and began to speak to people about mental health when I was doing book signings, and it's back and forth and back and forth. Those things seem so far apart, but they're really actually very closely related because we learn to heal through the power of story.
Amen.
Jesus did a lot of healing through his stories that he taught. We also learn about our own story and learn our own strength to overcome. And there's a lot in the ordinary hero that brings us to this sense of a broken person, broken by the world standards, in other words, can become the greatest hero of any story, including the divine story. And I love that about blending mental health and story. And in fact, I used a lot of story as a counselor. I used a lot of analogies to help people understand how they could get from point A to point B and understand their own backstory. It's just a very easy tool to help people comprehend and connect. And through story, through the power of novels and stories, we can learn greater empathy about people than we ordinarily would if we were just passing them by on the street. So the novel is a wonderful vehicle to develop compassion for those who aren't just like us.
Absolutely. Have you ever heard of Jordan Peterson? Have you heard of that guy?
No, I
That
have
man.
not.
Well, he's a psychologist. He's a counselor as well, but he's also kind of a philosopher, and he gets on and does a lot of debates and talks to people. But he's a big believer in story, right? He's a big believer in the power of story, and I like listening to him. Although some people may or may not agree with all of his politics, but I like listening to him because he delves into why we have myths, why we have all these stories throughout human history, and that they have meaning. That's it's important that they have meaning, and that we look into what this says about who we are as people and all that kind of stuff. And so I think you're right. Especially we can see how Jesus really tried to connect with people through story. He wasn't lying. He was just giving an example of a real world kind of context that could show people the power of the truth that was behind it. And there's even other cultures. I was talking with someone yesterday about other cultures that won't just expressly tell you what they want to say. Like African cultures or Middle Eastern cultures, which Jesus was a part of, right? They will, when they're trying to teach you something, they won't say, now go do this and go do that. They'll say, once there was a bird, or whatever. They'll come up with a story with a lesson, and that's where a lot of these myths come from. And so how have you seen kind of mental illness or mental health or mental disabilities or whatever, how have you seen that been portrayed maybe in some ways that you think might need to get addressed? Because I know you talk about this a lot, but what are some ways that you see in literature or in certain things that mental illness and mental disabilities might need to be addressed in a more kind of humane way, right?
It is getting better, as we talked about before the podcast.
Yeah.
However, there's still a few writers that will lean toward the stereotype. It's cheap, it's easy, and we want to make everybody with bipolar disorder look the same. Everybody who's an alcoholic look the same. There's the stereotypical alcoholic cop that always has a cigarette in his mouth, and he's rough and he's angry, and every cop is not the same. So why do we have to make every alcoholic cop the same? It's just, why can't we just be a little bit more complex with our characters and give them some vividness and some beauty to what is best about them, not just what is like every other person with this disorder? Because no two people with the same disorder look exactly the same. Everyone should be unique. So we should always really strive as writers to avoid stereotypes. Good. Or anything that looks like a stereotype, because that in and of itself is going to be degrading and demeaning, and it's not going to give your story any benefit either.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point about making your characters complex. I think a lot of times, I'm just thinking throughout the years in the movies and the books, like a lot of times the character with the mental illness was the villain. Right. Mm-hmm. A lot of times the character with the mental illness was kind of not useless, but maybe they were a foil for something or whatever. And I think that where we're kind of getting to in our culture, which I think is good, is like I was corrected a few years ago when I talked about special needs people. And mm-hmm. someone corrected me and they said, no, say a person with special needs, like to really see people as people with, and they might have some of these other things. But if I was whatever, if I had a bad knee or something, right? If I had a knee injury, I wouldn't say a knee injury person, right? I would say, right? You say you happen to be a person. That's just one aspect of who you are. That's not the mm-hmm. whole entirety of your personhood or your humanity. And I think that's a good point that you're making, is that when we're writing characters, not to let stereotypes happen, but also for it to just be one part of who they are, right? I mean, I think that's a big part of it, right? Exactly. You want to make sure that you develop that character fully enough that you can see all of those things that people can relate to when they don't have a mental illness or a cognitive disability or anything that you're adding to that character that's part of who they are. You want to make sure that you have all the other parts of who they are. And then people can begin to connect and say, oh, I could be there too. And then they begin to really relate to the character. And that's where the power of the story is when we can relate to those characters and begin to develop empathy. Yeah. And I know you said that I shouldn't do this, but I'm just thinking in the beginning, from what I can remember in literature, it was usually people with Down syndrome that I saw in movies or in, there were some movies and there were some things that tried to bring some of these things out. Why do you think it's taken so long for us as an entertainment culture, or maybe just the American culture, to kind of get to this point of dignifying and not stigmatizing kind of people with mental illness or mental disabilities, or I know those are very different, but for those kind of things, that it's taken us so long, in my opinion, to kind of get to that place of really dignifying them. Why do you think that is?
People want to believe that they can't be in that position. So we, in fear, wanting to distance ourselves from anything that looks vulnerable, will automatically create this buffer and say, I'm not like that and I could never be like that. So there's this unconscious desire for human beings to distance themselves from anybody that looks like they would be vulnerable and make them seem even less than, rather than reaching out, connecting, and lifting them up. This has happened with racism, with gender biases, with every other stereotype or prejudice that there is, because out of distancing, we do that out of fear more than we do out of pride, because the pride comes from fear.
Right.
We are in our insecurity, want to elevate ourselves by putting other people down. And that's why I think it has taken so long. It has taken some people to come into the light that are heroic, that have had mental illnesses or cognitive disabilities, that have proven to us that they deserve respect. And then once we see that they've achieved these things, we say, oh, maybe I could connect to this person and it's no longer a threat. I know nobody thinks that consciously, but that's part of the unconscious process that's going on with society, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right in the general sense that it's difficult for us sometimes to get out of who we are and connect with people that are different from us. And it takes more work, right? It takes more work to connect to people who are different from us. And I lived in a different country, and people who were expats all gathered together a lot, right? I mean, like you had that common experience, and we like to gather with people with those kind of common languages and experiences. And I think it takes a lot of work to get kind of beyond that. But as we were talking about earlier, that's kind of the point of literature, right? That's the point of telling stories, is to get beyond your experience and to get into other people's experience, right?
Absolutely. And this is a tremendous opportunity for us to benefit from the beauty of people who aren't like us.
Right.
And people with mental illnesses throughout Scripture have been beneficial to the kingdom of God in ways that other people have not been. I mean, if you look at King David, he had all of the symptoms of bipolar disorder. And he was the man after God's own heart. He was actually the predecessor to Jesus Christ. This is a pivotal, very, very important patriarch. And why would we then, as Christians in the church, think of dismissing or putting down people with mental illnesses, when in Scripture, God was obviously using not just David, but there were plenty of other examples of people with symptoms of mental illnesses that are in Scripture that God chose and used as patriarchs and leaders and foundational people for the kingdom of God.
Yeah, and I'm even just thinking about people in Christian history as well, right? I mean, I've read quotes about Spurgeon dealing with depression. Martin Luther was supposedly had some very difficult mental issues that he had to deal with. And yet these men, especially Luther, Luther in his own way changed history. With the Protestant Reformation, we study about him in just regular history class because it was such a momentous shift that happened in our culture in regards to religion and all that kind of stuff. I'm also thinking about one example that I really appreciated when it came out, and it's a great movie. And I was just maybe thinking if I could get your thoughts on it if you've seen it. But have you seen As Good as It Gets? The movie As Good as It Gets?
Oh, I love that movie. Yeah.
And
I've seen it.
And I just remember watching that movie and thinking, man, they took this guy with this kind of mental disorder kind of thing, and yet totally humanized him, totally made us care for him. He was a jerk, and he had all these kind of issues, but they did such a great job writing him and making us care about him. And I don't know if you remember that as well, if you have any thoughts on that movie.
I thought it was interesting that the guy that was the worst jerk in the movie was the writer, but that's just a side note. However, what I did love about that movie the most was that the interaction of the characters helped them become more able to cope with their mental illnesses. So it was through connecting that they were able to find healing and find fulfillment in their lives. And I love that story because it shows not just how human people are, and all of us have something, some kind of brokenness, some kind of vulnerability that we're dealing with. But when we reach out to each other, we can better one another's lives. We can improve the world through that in ways that we don't even realize we're making others' lives better just by being our best in certain situations. So I love that about that movie. Yeah. And that is the power of story right there. I mean, right. Being able to, in spite of where you are, maybe because of where you are in your own brokenness, you can actually impact the world and make it a better place.
Yeah, and we were talking before the podcast about a book that I really like, and I'll just tell everybody about it if they haven't read it. It's called The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime. And I really love this book because the setup is he's a young man, he's a teenager, and he's autistic, the main character, the perspective character. And his hero is Sherlock Holmes, because Sherlock Holmes would notice all these details that nobody else noticed. And he really related to Sherlock Holmes, right? That was his hero. And so he finds this dead dog that had been murdered or had been killed in a neighbor's front yard. This is all the beginning setup of the book. And so he decides he's going to be like Sherlock Holmes and discover who the killer was and what happened. Like this is a mystery. And of course, through the whole thing, he finds out a whole bunch of other stuff that he didn't know, because he had been kind of sheltered as a younger, teen. Anyway, it's a great book. And I just think that there's so much that we can write in relation to these things. People complain about, the top 9 out of 10 movies in the last year were all sequels or remakes, or there's no original kind of stories. But I really do think there's a lot of potential in dignifying people with different mental disabilities or illnesses or something, and humanizing them and making them a part of the story, and showing that they can be actually not just useful, but they don't have to be looked at as a curse or even as a disability, that they can have some level of strength about them because of these things. And so what might be some things you see that could be done? Like, what are some things you haven't seen that you think, man, I would love to see a character kind of portrayed with this mental illness or this mental disability or something with these things, and portrayed in a way that was unique, that we haven't maybe seen before? I don't know if you have any examples of that or have thought of that, but.
Well, I actually endorsed a book called The Bipolar Experience by Leanne Jeffries that was co-written by Eva Marie Everson. It was a couple of years ago that book came out, but it was a nonfiction book. I think it would be very interesting if we had more characters that were protagonists that suffered from bipolar disorder or even schizophrenia, that were not demonized with those disorders, because you see in the media, oftentimes we will have someone who has demonized someone on the stand as a defense, the defendant who's been in a crime, and they'll say they had bipolar disorder, which is an inaccurate diagnosis. Sometimes it's just the first thing that they come up with. And they'll say, oh, that's why they murdered their child. Well, no, probably not. And then that's what everybody sees in the media, this initial inaccurate diagnosis. We don't see, because people often are still hiding in shame over their mental illnesses. I think now that, Robin Williams and his struggle with depression has come out, and some of the other Hollywood celebrities have come out and said openly that they've struggled with anxiety or depression, that it's becoming more accepted for people to announce it. I think we should actually be doing so in literature and showing those individuals who struggle with severe mental health issues becoming heroes. And there are some things that are strengths of someone with bipolar disorder. As you see, especially in the case of David, someone with bipolar disorder is going to experience life with greater extremes of emotion. And so therefore, that's why David was able to write the poetry that he wrote, with the depth and breadth of emotion that he conveyed. You see a lot of people in art history that we now realize probably suffered from mental illnesses, but we can see the depth and breadth of emotion that comes through in their art in a way that people who don't experience that gamut of emotion would be able to convey. So there are strengths there. There are strengths of compassion, those who are trauma survivors. I'd love to see more trauma survivors as heroes of stories, because trauma survivors are more prevalent than they realize. And for the people who've suffered trauma to be able to connect with a hero and believe in themselves as a hero is extremely important toward healing. So I would love to see more of that. I just came from a conference, Writing from a Bleeding Heart, where trauma survivors were trying to learn how to write their own stories of severe background trauma. And it's very difficult to write your own story. Wouldn't it be great if they had fiction characters to connect with who were heroes that overcame the kinds of stories that they had overcome, and they knew that if this fictional character could do it, it would stir some hope in them to be able to do so as well. So
yeah, I think that's really amazing, because part of what I'm thinking about while you're talking is, the history of mental illness and, mental disability has been to hide it, right? Mm-hmm. Like even literally, like put them away in a special place just for them, right? You have hospitals for it. And I'm not saying sometimes in extreme cases.
Sometimes it's appropriate.
It's appropriate.
But usually not necessary.
but because of that history, which some of it is pretty dark, right? We could get into some of that history of how they treated people and how they didn't understand. And I think sometimes even what we still don't understand. I think we're still finding out and learning about, like we're talking about, the strengths of some of these things. I know for friends of mine who are very involved locally here in the autistic community, they are very clear that they feel their children are smart, they're capable, they have so much to give, just all of those things where we start to see what people can do instead of just what they can't. And I think in any good story, right, we want our characters to have something to overcome, and strengths and weaknesses and all of these things. And I just think it would, like you're saying, it would humanize and dignify a lot of people's struggle that a lot of people deal with, to bring it out and make them heroes, make them, give them something to do that shows that they have kind of that value in the world. And I think it would be great.
I think it would better mirror God's story. The Bible is fraught with all of the people who have dysfunctional families, mental illnesses, people who have suffered from trauma. All of that is throughout God's story. These are people God selected. He didn't select them and say, oh, you know what? I made a mistake. I didn't realize you had bipolar disorder. I should pick somebody else. Well, I'll work with what I got. And he knew before he picked him. Sure. He knew beforehand. And so he chose people intentionally. Why did he do that? And why shouldn't we do that? Right. Because God is better glorified when he chooses the people who are going to be the most amazing heroes. And people that are overcomers of great challenges and difficulty inspire all of us. It doesn't just dignify those with mental illnesses. It helps humanize all of us. It's beneficial to everyone when we choose people that are heroic characters in our stories that are struggling with mental illnesses or trauma or dysfunction or any of those things that the world would say are marks of shame. we can look at those differently and begin to say there's no shame in those who are seeking to be elevated and encouraged by the Spirit of God. There's no shame.
Yeah.
In fact, there's greater glory when we turn all of those things over to Him and He makes them into strengths. So,
yeah. And I think what we're getting to here is the shared experience of being human. That's really what's important. We talked about why do we read literature about different kinds of people or different places, or why do we do that? And it's the same with people with mental illnesses or mental disabilities or whatever. Is what we're really saying in all of this is that there's something more basic, basic's not the right word. There's something more internal and unseen that makes us human. Right? There's something different that goes beyond just the outside, the color of our skin, our gender, our abilities or disabilities, right? There's something that goes beyond all of that makes us human. And that's really what we're saying in literature, right? We're saying these stories are connecting us, not because I'm just like Mulan or whatever. I just saw the trailer for Mulan, and it's like one of my favorite Disney movies. And I'm like, yes, but I'm not a 16-year-old Chinese girl, right? But we can connect on those very basic, universal human qualities that we all long for: intimacy, community, love, all of those, purpose, all of those things that we all connect with. That's what story does to us, I think. And I just think it's an important part of it to add this to the list of things that we should consider when we're trying to have diverse characters. Can you think of any other examples that you've seen recently that you really appreciated, like in any other sort of movie or TV show or anything like that? Can you think of anything?
I loved The Good Doctor. Have you seen that TV show?
Yeah.
That's got an autistic doctor. And I love that he's young, and that counts against him, and that he is also autistic, but he's high-functioning autistic. So I've met with a couple of parents of autistic children who had said, that is not like my child. Well, if you've seen one autistic person, you've seen one.
Exactly.
They're not anything like one another. We need to understand how very different everyone is. So that is an important thing to keep in mind. Sometimes in our writing, we need to include more than one trauma victim or more than one person with a specific disorder, as long as it's not especially rare. But that helps to give us a better sense of complexity of that character when you don't simply say, this is what everyone's like who has this.
Good.
So that could be a way to get around that issue, possibly. So, but I think you're right. I think we all connect with people, and the deeper that we can connect with people and the more diverse we can make our connections, the more it enriches us as human beings, because diversity grows us. Connection binds us and gives us strength together, but the diversity helps us to grow and be able to flourish. When we only are like just people like us, and that's all we ever learn from, that's all we ever do, we are not really growing.
That's really good. How would you maybe counsel people or encourage people to do research in some of these things? Like, how would you maybe point people to something that, if they're saying, wow, I would like to do this, I would like to put more diversity of some of these things into play. What are some of those avenues where people could research, where writers could do some research in this area, to do it in a very authentic and believable and complex way?
They need to do multidimensional research, not just one kind of research. So you need to know the DSM categories and all of the things that list all the symptoms and how many of those symptoms they need to actually have this disorder. So you need to know the clinical background and what the prevalence is and what this looks like and what the epidemiology is. So know that, do that clinical research. And then you also need to do some experiential research so that you get anecdotal information from real people. So if you're researching alcoholics or addicts, you need to go to an NA meeting or an AA meeting or an Al-Anon meeting and get to know what the family members are experiencing and get real life stories from real people, and make sure you get more than one. Because again, one person is not going to be representative of everyone, and you might get a skewed picture or an inaccurate picture, since someone who has an alcohol problem may also have a personality disorder. And if you interview that person as your only anecdotal information, you will get a very untrue picture of what it's like to be an alcoholic. Because a personality disorder, if they don't tell you that's what they have, is going to make everything look completely different.
Right. No, I think that's really good, because there are so many ways, like you're saying, to research. Don't just rely upon, well, I read the clinical definition, I think I have a good idea. Mm-hmm. Part of it is to humanize it, so to start to talk to people. Have you had experience with that? Like, what has been your experience when you try to maybe talk to some people to get some anecdotal evidence or stories? What's been your experience with people? Are they willing to do that? Is it just kind of varied depending on the person, their willingness to participate?
Usually people are very appreciative if you go in with the idea that you want to dignify those who are suffering from mental illness, and you want to create a realistic picture that's going to make this a complex character where people are going to appreciate and celebrate the protagonist. They appreciate that because they're tired of being shamed.
Yeah.
And they've been shamed long enough. So they are definitely supportive of that. If you want to go to an NA meeting or an AA meeting, I have never been to one when I was training to be a counselor where they said, ask me why I was there, or wanted to kick me out. They're welcoming to everybody that wants to come in. You simply have to respect their confidentiality. That's another thing. You don't tell everybody's story and write their name. You make sure that you're just going to kind of get a feel for what that story is like. You're not going to write that individual's personal story into your novel without their permission. Good. Never, ever do that. That is disrespectful and against the law. So make sure you don't do that. But you can also look on sites. There are some websites that are support systems for people who are suffering from different mental illnesses or addiction issues or dysfunction or trauma history. So you can look into that. But again, be respectful. Don't take someone's story and repost it on Facebook. Hey, look what make sure you respect their confidentiality. And that would be the most important thing that I would say you need to make sure you do when you're looking at people's stories. Don't tell anybody else's story as if it's your own. Just get a feel for what it's like, what the experience of living with that mental illness or addiction would be like, so that you can write from your perspective after you have vicariously experienced it through hearing their story to some degree.
Good. I appreciate that. Because I think there's some similarities in, like we've been talking about, some similarities with, writing characters who aren't like me in any way. I mean, I should have some level of connection with people that are at least similar to that, and be able to, ask them. I kind of love that. That's been happening in recent literature, where people are encouraging you to say, look, if you're writing about a character that you're not, that you're, whatever, has a different race or different gender or whatever, ask somebody to read it, read that and see if that connects with them, or how they feel about it. Is this dignifying you? Is this stigmatizing you? Is this too cliche, or, all that kind of stuff. Because sensitivity
readers.
Yeah,
that's what
sensitivity
they're called.
readers.
So make sure you look for those. And NAMI, the National Association for Mental Illness, has support group meetings as well. You might be able to find someone who's willing to serve as a sensitivity reader for mental illness from a NAMI organization. So they have local chapters usually in all kinds of places. Yeah. So that might be a good resource.
Yeah. Well, I love it. And let's tell people how they can get in touch with you, how they can find you. I know how to get in touch with you, obviously. But let's tell people what your website is and the different things. I know you have a book coming out. So just kind of tell people how they can get in touch with you.
Okay. My main website is pretty simple. It's tinayeager.com. There's no www. There's just https, tinayeager.com. And on that site, you put a slash and put Flourishment, and you can find my new podcast, Flourish-MEANT. And I also have that new book, Beautiful Warrior, Finding Victory Over the Lies Formed Against You. It's on Christ-centered and clinical and personal tips for women to build their self-esteem, identity, and purpose in life. And that is releasing July 15th, this coming Monday. I'm not sure when this podcast is going to air, but that is when it's going to be available for purchase. You can pre-order it now and get in on that $300 pre-order contest if you like. That would be an exciting win for any of your listeners to be able to get in on. So there's that. And I have a Facebook party coming up on Monday, July 15th in the evening. So look forward to more information on that. You can look on the Beautiful Warrior Facebook page to find more information.
Nice. Well, I'll obviously include all those links as we post. This will be going on the Serious Writer website as well. We're on that blog, so this will be going on there as a resource for writers. And I just really appreciate your time, Tina. Like I said, I was really excited about this conversation. Just as I've had more and more experience and connection with people over my lifetime who have either mental disabilities or illnesses, and a lot of that stigma just has gone away in my life. And so I was just really excited to talk about how we can celebrate them as heroes, because some of those people are heroes in my life now, right? Because I know them and I know how amazing they are, and I see just how hard they try and just the heroic nature of their life. And so this has been a really good conversation. I appreciate it, Tina.
Thank you. I appreciate being here, and I'm honored to be your guest.
All right. Well, we'll talk to you soon, okay?
Okay.